Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where even the slightest clink of a fork could determine your entire social fate. You trudge through a grand dining hall, velvet curtains brushing your elbows, the scent of roasted meats mingling with polished silver, and you realize, one wrong move here, and you probably won't survive this socially. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world we're quietly panicking over napkin folds tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorian dining table was a battlefield disguised as refinement. You pick up your knife, feeling the cool weight in your hand, aware that placing it incorrectly could trigger whispered gossip across the mahogany expanse. Forks had their own hierarchy, knives demanded respect, and spoons were rarely simple tools, they were subtle markers of class. The soup spoon, oval and slightly larger than the dessert variety, demanded attention. Miss that, and someone might write you off as hopelessly uneducated. You probably didn't realize that dropping a fork wasn't just embarrassing. It could force the nearest gentleman or lady to drop into a formal apology exchange, a choreography that historians still argue about regarding its frequency and severity. Napkins, too, were more than cloth, they were shields. You place yours on your lap, remembering that the fold mattered. Too casual, and you're reckless. Too stiff, and you're ostentatious. Some families even had embroidered initials on the napkins, which were used as social identification, almost like a Victorian RFID tag. Fringe practices included using a napkin to discreetly dab the corners of your mouth in secret signals to a dining partner. Historians still argue whether these subtle communications were widespread or just rumor-fueled legend. And then there's the food itself. Oysters served with ceremony, roasts carved in a precise sequence, sauces passed in a rhythm almost musical. You notice someone leaning too far forward, elbows daring to touch the table, and feel an involuntary shudder. Etiquette books from the period instructed diners to avoid certain motions, gestures, and even facial expressions. A sneeze required a small handkerchief ritual, and burping. Absolutely scandalous. Some families even had silent dining hours where conversation was minimal, a practice that feels alien yet oddly serene to modern sensibilities. You could almost hear the faint clatter of china and the quiet murmurs of a society obsessed with appearances. Imagine trying to sip soup without looking like a savage, all while maintaining the posture of a royal portrait. Cheeky as it sounds, some guests carried tiny mirrors under the table to ensure their smile never faltered. A fringe practice? Certainly, but one documented in letters that historians still argue about regarding how widely it was adopted. And as the roast is carved and sauces circulate, you realize the dinner table was a stage. Every movement scrutinized, every gesture a statement, every bite a potential scandal. Remember, the next time you complain about figuring out chopsticks or a dinner menu, these people spent hours perfecting the proper rotation of forks and the correct tilt of napkins. By the end of a meal, you might feel exhausted simply by surviving socially intact. And yet there's a strange rhythm to it, a dance of politeness and power that somehow kept the wheels of society spinning. You might even catch yourself admiring the precision, or maybe just hoping no one notices you've buttered your bread too enthusiastically. By the time dessert arrives, fruit tarts glistening under crystal chandeliers. Understand that Victorian dining etiquette wasn't just about avoiding embarrassment. It was a language. Each placement, each pause, each polite murmur communicated rank, taste, and attention to detail. You might smirk at the notion, but consider that historians still argue whether the rules were enforced universally, or if much of it was exaggerated in etiquette manuals, aimed more at scaring the lower classes than guiding the elite. Still, as you carefully set down your fork after a delicate slice of cake, you feel a strange satisfaction in having survived this first ordeal. You step away from the polished table and into the drawing room, where every word you speak feels like it's being weighed on an invisible scale. The art of conversation, as Victorians called it, wasn't just small talk. It was a minefield disguised as polite chatter. You trudge past velvet armchairs, your shoes whispering against patterned carpets, and realize that opening your mouth incorrectly could undo hours of careful social maneuvering. Yes, in this world, a casual remark about the weather could spiral into scandal, and you probably won't survive this verbally unless you pay attention. Conversation had rules so specific that manuals sometimes devoted entire chapters to permissible topics. You might comment on literature, art, or the virtues of newly introduced flowers, but steer clear of politics, religion, or anything hinting at sex. Even compliments required precision. A misapplied word could sound either insincere or dangerously forward. Imagine a polite nod gone wrong. It might read as mockery. Historians still argue whether these boundaries were strictly followed in everyday parlors, or if they were more aspirational guidelines for the socially ambitious. Some families enforced whispered communication methods for subtlety, leaning close to share observations about other guests while maintaining a mask of discretion. Fringe practices included using coded coughs or tugs of a glove to indicate approval or disapproval during discussions. You might notice someone lightly tapping the arm of a chair with a fan and obscure gesture signaling agreement, or perhaps mild annoyance. Most people probably never mastered these signals, but for those who did, it was a secret language of power and refinement. Tone mattered immensely. You are supposed to speak softly, but audibly enough to be heard by the intended audience. Too loud, and you are aggressive. Too quiet, and you are timid. Even laughter was an instrument, calibrated for decibels and timing. Some houses had laughter windows, where mirthful sounds were encouraged only in certain areas, creating a controlled, almost theatrical atmosphere. Fringe though it may seem, letters from the era describe guests intentionally stifling their giggles during tea, a practice that seems comically stressful to modern ears. Listening was considered just as critical as speaking. You lean forward, nodding subtly, maintaining eye contact, and avoid interrupting. Interruptions, however small, could be interpreted as challenges to authority or breeding. The ritual of turn-taking in conversation sometimes included waiting for a faint cough or a hand signal before responding. Historians still argue whether these intricate systems were widespread or limited to elite circles. Manners extended to the choice of words. "I think" was safer than "I know," and even stating facts required careful hedging. You notice someone commenting on a recent play and carefully qualifying every opinion, a linguistic dance meant to show knowledge without arrogance. Fringe etiquette even dictated the correct use of metaphors. Poetic language suggested refinement, but overly florid imagery risked mockery. You could almost hear the soft shuffling of etiquette manuals being consulted in secret, guiding hands trembling with social anxiety. Then there's the timing of conversation. Pauses weren't just natural, they were strategic. You inhale, allow the space to fill with ambient murmurs, then deliver your line as though it were a delicate musical note. Respond too quickly, and you are overeager. Too slowly, and you are considered dull or disengaged. Observing these rhythms feels exhausting, yet oddly mesmerizing. Historians still argue whether everyday Victorians truly adhered to this precision, or if such elaborate systems were exaggerated for instruction manuals meant to impress newcomers to polite society. By the end of an evening, you might find yourself marveling at how a simple chat required a blend of psychology, performance, and courage. The art of conversation wasn't merely social, it was survival. Subtle warfare disguised as civility. And as you quietly sip your tea, after successfully navigating a delicate compliment exchange, you realize that mastering these verbal rules was both a badge of refinement and a kind of self-inflicted training in patience, poise, and occasionally, paranoia. You drift toward the windows, where sunlight filters through heavy velvet drapes, dust motes dancing lazily in the beams, and you suddenly realize that even privacy comes with its own rules. In Victorian homes, curtains weren't just decoration, they were instruments of social control. You trudge along the polished floorboards, fingertips brushing the tassels, and notice that every draw and tieback carries meaning. Open them at the wrong hour, or in the wrong way, and neighbors or even casual passers-by might silently judge your family's respectability. Yes, you probably won't survive this invasion of social optics unscathed. Curtains were often color-coded or layered to signal household status or intent. Light, gauzy curtains suggested leisure and openness, while heavy brocades communicated wealth and discretion. Historians still argue whether these choices were strictly about aesthetics or deeply rooted in social signaling. Fringe practices included retracting curtains slightly to peek outside during specific times of day, essentially creating a socially sanctioned surveillance, giving subtle hints about the family's routines or visitors' acceptability. Imagine balancing curiosity with propriety while avoiding the dreaded gossip patrol outside. Doors, too, had unspoken protocols. You open a door just enough to signal welcome, but not intrusion, always knocking lightly if uncertain. Failing to do so could be considered impertinent or even rude. Some families enforced elaborate rituals: 1 knock for casual acquaintances, 3 for formal visitors. Fringe anecdotes describe hidden signals, like a handkerchief hung on the knob, to indicate whether one could enter freely or must wait. Historians still argue how widespread such coded communications were beyond the aristocracy. Windows weren't purely ornamental. They framed both literal and social boundaries. You learned that in certain districts, women's windows were subtly curtained to indicate availability for conversation or discreet visitors. This was less about voyeurism and more about managing the perception of propriety. Fringe texts even hint at using mirrors to catch glimpses of passing neighbors while remaining hidden like a silent, socially acceptable spy game. Inside the home, furniture placement reinforced these privacy norms. Chairs angled toward doors allowed subtle observation of entrances without breaking the rule of stillness, and tables were arranged to direct conversation and sightlines strategically. Every visual cue mattered. You trudge past a faintly polished sideboard, noting how the light falls in patterns designed to highlight wealth without seeming ostentatious, and wonder whether these cues were consciously designed or evolved naturally over generations. Historians still argue the degree of intentionality behind these interior choices. Even domestic chores were affected. Drawing the curtains at precisely the right time could signal meal readiness or the start of an evening gathering. Failing this small ritual might suggest laziness or disorder. Fringe accounts mention young housemaids being disciplined for improperly tying back draperies, emphasizing that even minor errors could have social consequences beyond the immediate household. The precise movement of fabric became a subtle form of etiquette, blending utility with performance. By the end of the day, you notice how the interplay of curtains, doors, and windows created a choreography of perception. You realize that privacy in Victorian society wasn't simply about closing off the inside from the outside. It was about managing impressions, crafting signals, and navigating a labyrinth where even a partially open sash could send the wrong message. Walking back toward the center of the room, you can almost hear the faint whispers of ancestors reminding you that propriety, surveillance, and display were inseparable. And as you carefully draw back a drape, revealing just enough light. You feel a strange thrill in having participated in this delicate, silent performance of social power. You step into the garden path, gravel crunching beneath your boots, and suddenly, the world of courtship codes unfolds like a carefully scripted dance. Handkerchiefs flutter, parasols tilt just so, and every glance or lack thereof carries weight. You realize that dating in Victorian society wasn't about casual coffee or awkward first texts. It was a precise choreography, where one misstep could instantly signal impropriety. Yes, you probably won't survive this socially unless you master the art of subtle signaling. The courtship ritual was governed by proximity rules. Walking too close could be considered forward, too far, and you appeared disinterested. Some manuals prescribed an exact number of steps between potential partners during promenades, measured in paces. Historians still argue whether these distances were strictly followed or mostly advisory. Fringe practices included leaving small gifts along the walking route as signals of interest, perhaps a single flower tied to a fence post intended to demonstrate both affection and ingenuity without speaking a word. Handkerchiefs were more than hygiene. They were instruments of romantic communication. A gentle drop could invite assistance. A delicate toss might signal consent, and an embroidered handkerchief could convey status or familial approval. You trudge along, noticing a lady adjusting hers at the corner of the walkway, and realize she's sending subtle messages that could dictate the outcome of months of courtship. Fringe stories even suggest some young men memorized complex handkerchief codes for multiple families in town, a practice historians still debate regarding its prevalence. Parasol etiquette was equally demanding. Tilting one just so might shield the face from sun or unwanted attention, while angling it differently could indicate availability for conversation. You almost laugh at the precision required, yet you feel the tension in your own arms as you mimic the gestures. Some fringe etiquette guides even describe parasol taps or spins to signal the start or end of courtship dances, a nearly forgotten language of gestures that has part legend, part reality. Distance wasn't the only concern. Timing was crucial. Evening walks needed approval from a guardian or chaperone, and meetings in public spaces were often strategically arranged to appear casual yet supervised. You trudge past a gazebo, imagining a chaperone hidden among flowering shrubs, silently ensuring that the conversation adheres to the correct script. Historians still argue how strictly these chaperone rules were enforced outside the upper classes. Gift-giving intersected with courtship, too. Small tokens, a book, a ribbon, a pressed flower, were loaded with meaning, and the wrong choice could imply ignorance or arrogance. You watch a suitor offer a single bloom, noting the careful bow accompanying it, and realize that every gesture was scrutinized, not just by the recipient, but by the entire social circle. Fringe accounts suggest secret exchanges of miniature letters or charms during dances, a subversive but risky practice, leaving room for historical debate about how common such practices really were. By the time a promenade concludes, you notice that Victorian courtship was less about spontaneous affection and more about performance, observation, and coded communication. Every step, glance, and gesture carried potential consequences, reinforcing social hierarchies and expectations. You probably won't survive this world unscathed without a crash course in these subtle cues. Yet there's a strange elegance in the structure, a rhythm that rewards careful attention and punishes recklessness. And as the sun dips behind wrought iron fences, you can almost hear the whispered applause of ancestors, impressed by your successful navigation of these intricate, often invisible, codes of attraction. You follow the echoing footsteps of a distant funeral procession, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and faint crepe fabric, and you realize that mourning in Victorian society was not merely an expression of grief, it was a disciplined performance. The mourning manual dictated how long you should wear black, what fabrics were appropriate, and even how your jewelry should respond to loss. Yes, you probably won't survive this socially, unless you understand the nuanced choreography of sorrow. Mourning periods were carefully timed. Widows, for instance, were expected to wear full black crepe for up to a year or more, gradually easing into lighter shades over time. Jewelry followed equally strict rules. Jet beads, brooches with hair of the deceased, and plain rings each conveyed subtle messages about the mourner's status and fidelity. Historians still argue whether these rules were consistently applied or if exceptions were quietly ignored in practice. Fringe practices included miniature portraits or lockets hidden under clothing, worn only in private moments, a quiet rebellion against public grief, or perhaps an intimate homage. The clothing itself was a kind of social signal. You trudge past a velvet mourning dress, its heavy fabric clinging in dim candlelight, and realize that even movement had to appear composed. Corsets made breathing and bending deliberate. Long sleeves prevented the accidental display of skin. Fringe accounts described families keeping spare gloves and veils ready at all times. To avoid the horror of unprepared exposure to social scrutiny, historians still debate how pervasive this meticulous planning truly was. Grief rituals extended beyond apparel. Social withdrawal was common. Gatherings, dances, or even casual teas could be prohibited. You feel the weight of absence in every empty chair, the hush in formerly lively parlors. Some families marked mourning with a strict schedule, signaling friends when interactions were acceptable, subtly enforcing boundaries with handwritten cards or veiled letters. Fringe observations include mourning visits, where participants were expected to appear solemn, yet not entirely lifeless, a paradoxical demand still puzzling scholars. Children were not exempt. Boys and girls of certain ages were expected to wear miniature versions of adult mourning attire, learning early the performative aspect of grief. You notice a young girl with her tiny black bonnet, fidgeting slightly, yet attempting perfect posture, a small but telling illustration of societal pressure. Historians still argue whether such practices were universally adopted or mostly observed among the upper classes. There was even an unspoken hierarchy of mourning. How recent, how close, and how publicly one grieved could elevate or diminish one's reputation. You watch a family friend linger a little too long in black crepe at a tea party, and you can almost hear the silent calculations of neighbors judging every fold and frill. Fringe etiquette mentions coded gestures, like the subtle adjustment of a bracelet or a gentle tug on a veil, to communicate adherence to these rules without a word spoken. By the end of a week or perhaps a season, you feel the relentless weight of these invisible expectations. Mourning was no longer just personal sorrow. It was a public performance, carefully crafted and meticulously observed. Yet despite its rigidity, there is a certain reverent beauty to it. Grief transformed into rhythm, fabric, and gesture. You trudge past the fading candlelight, noting the subtle sheen on a widow's crepe, and realize that surviving Victorian mourning required patience, precision, and a subtle mastery of display, all while honoring the deceased. It's exhausting, it's intricate, and yet undeniably fascinating. You step back into the morning light, the chill of dawn brushing your cheeks, and immediately your eyes are drawn to the intricate dance of Victorian fashion. Dress for success or avoid shame, as it might have been whispered in etiquette manuals, was more than clothing. It was armor, a carefully constructed image designed to declare status and propriety. You probably won't survive this world socially without mastering the subtleties of corsets, top hats, and gloves, and yes, even the mysterious parasol was a tool of power. Corsets dominate the landscape first. You trudge along a cobblestone street, noting the women adjusting the stiff boning beneath voluminous skirts, waistlines cinched to near impossibility. Historians still argue whether the extreme tightness was truly common or mostly a theatrical exaggeration. But fringe accounts describe secret gatherings where women compared waist sizes like badges of honor or silent badges of suffering. Movement in such attire is a deliberate act. Sitting, walking, even bending becomes a subtle performance, each action sending a message of discipline, elegance, or social aspiration. Men, too, played their part. Top hats were not merely headgear. They conveyed authority, taste, and in some circles, subtle competitiveness. You notice a gentleman tipping his hat ever so slightly while passing a group of peers, a gesture signaling politeness, yet hinting at social rank. Gloves were worn religiously, both to protect skin and as a silent statement of refinement. Fringe practices included switching glove colors for different occasions, or subtly signaling availability, or intention. Historians still argue whether these color codes were widely recognized or isolated to select elite circles. Accessories extended into the absurdly meticulous. Parasols weren't just sun shields. Their angle, fabric, and decoration indicated temperament and social openness. You trudge past one with a delicate lace canopy, angled perfectly to shield the face but allow glances, and realize it's part of an unspoken dialogue with the world. Fringe etiquette even suggested tapping the parasol twice to indicate availability for conversation, a signal as subtle as it was precarious. Footwear demanded attention too. Buttoned boots, dainty slippers, or polished shoes each marked social class, occasion, and decorum. Imagine stepping out of line, figuratively or literally, in such footwear. A scuff could be a silent insult, a misstep a gentle scandal. The layering of fabrics, textures, and accessories created a language of its own, one that communicated knowledge, propriety, and wealth with every flutter of a skirt or adjustment of a glove. The culmination of Victorian dress was the overall silhouette. You trudge past mirrors reflecting carefully arranged ensembles, noticing how posture complements clothing. Each fold, drape, or angle is scrutinized. Fringe tailies tell of women carrying tiny hidden mirrors under skirts to check their reflection, discreetly during social visits, a practice historians still debate in terms of prevalence. Men, in turn, adjusted cravats, cuffs, and coattails to communicate taste, subtlety, and attention to detail. By mid-afternoon, you feel the exhausting precision of Victorian attire pressing on you. Yet there is an undeniable rhythm to it. Clothing as conversation, posture as punctuation, accessories as signals. It's performative, exacting, and at times whimsical. You notice the soft creak of corsets and the quiet shuffle of polished boots, and realize that surviving socially required more than courage. It required the elegance of discipline, the creativity of subtle messaging, and a willingness to participate in this endlessly fascinating sartorial ballet. You sink into a velvet chair, the scent of ink and parchment filling your senses, and suddenly, you re-transported into the world of letters, an arena where etiquette was measured in pen strokes rather than footsteps. Letter writing labyrinth demanded precision, patience, and a delicate touch. One misaligned seal or improperly folded page could tarnish a reputation. You probably won't survive this socially unless you understand that Victorian correspondence was part art, part diplomacy, and part subtle psychological warfare. Every element of a letter mattered. You trudge your fingers along the embossed edges of stationery, noting how the paper's weight, color, and texture conveyed social standing. Envelopes required exact folds, and the use of wax seals indicated authenticity, formality, or, in some fringe cases, secret codes between families. Historians still argue whether these rules were strictly enforced across social classes or mostly observed by the upper echelon. Penmanship itself was ritualized. Loops, slants, and spacing communicated education, refinement, and attention to detail. You notice a particularly delicate flourish in the signature of a visiting friend, a subtle mark of status meant to impress without overt display. Fringe accounts mention hidden symbols in the lettering, tiny cues readable only by the initiated, a playful yet risky form of private communication. Some letters even contained invisible ink, revealing messages only under specific light conditions, a technique historians still debate regarding how widely it was employed. Tone dictated meaning as much as words. You trudge through a paragraph, careful to maintain humility while expressing opinion, because too strong a declaration could imply arrogance, while too weak a statement suggested ignorance. Letters served as proxies for conversation, often replacing in-person visits with carefully curated language to project composure and tact. Some manuals recommended reading letters aloud in private to gauge their emotional resonance before sending, a practice that seems oddly theatrical but demonstrates the lengths Victorians went to maintain decorum. The folding of the letter was as meaningful as the words themselves. Triangular folds signaled respect. Horizontal folds suggested intimacy. Certain corners tucked in could indicate urgency or deferment. Fringe guides even detailed the precise angle of folding as a social cue, although historians still argue whether such details were widely recognized or mostly aspirational advice. Postage and addressing also followed strict conventions, from the salutation to the postscript, ensuring that social hierarchies and proper respect were maintained even in transit. Correspondence also allowed for subtle displays of wit or flirtation, provided the signals were coded correctly. You notice a small, almost imperceptible dash or underline a discreet nudge, a hidden meaning. Fringe examples describe miniature illustrations or marginalia used to indicate inside jokes or family secrets, a quiet rebellion against rigid formality. Historians still debate whether such playful deviations were common or limited to particularly audacious correspondence. By the end of an evening spent drafting, sealing, and sending letters, you feel the meticulous weight of Victorian communication. The letter was more than words on paper. It was a stage, a performance, a means to project self, navigate social hierarchies, and even whisper secrets under the watchful eyes of society. You trudge back from your writing desk, noting the faint scent of ink, wax, and possibility, understanding that surviving this world required patience, precision, and an almost meditative attention to detail skills that made each letter a small victory in the labyrinthine social dance of Victorian life. You step into the grand ballroom, the scent of polished wood and faint candle wax mingling in the air, and immediately feel the weight of the dance floors and social strategy. Every bow, every curtsy, every glide across the floor carried meaning. One misstep could ripple through the entire social network, leaving you mortified. You probably won't survive this socially unless you master the subtle choreography of movement, posture, and timing. Dance was not mere entertainment. It was a form of communication. You trudge in carefully, noting the spacing between couples and the precise angles of bows. The order of introduction, the way a partner's hand is offered or received, even the rhythm of steps, conveyed refinement, status, and intent. Historians still argue whether the strict codes described in dance manuals were consistently applied or mainly aspirational ideals. Fringe practices included signaling interest or approval through subtle tilts of the head or fingers. A language so nuanced that misinterpretation could result in social faux pas. The type of dance mattered immensely. Waltzes, polkas, and quadrilles each had specific rules governing spacing, eye contact, and grip. You notice a gentleman adjusting his grip ever so slightly, a demonstration of confidence and awareness, signaling propriety without overstepping bounds. Some manuals even prescribed how many revolutions around the floor were socially acceptable, how long to linger near a partner, and when to disengage gracefully. Historians still argue whether these highly detailed prescriptions were commonly followed, or if they served more as instructional theater for ambitious debutantes and their escorts. Music dictated rhythm, but etiquette dictated pacing. You glide across the floor, paying attention to tempo and timing, as abrupt or slow movements could suggest arrogance or clumsiness. Fringe advice suggested mimicking the posture of highly regarded dancers as a mark of subtle emulation, though whether this was widely practiced remains debated. Even the choice of shoes influenced performance. Stiff boots or delicate slippers could alter balance, subtly communicating status and physical control. Observation was key. You trudged past clusters of spectators, noting whispers, nods, and discreet glances. One poorly timed spin or clumsy curtsy could trigger a cascade of gossip and indirect form of social punishment. Some fringe anecdotes describe trial dances, where debutantes practiced with invisible partners in private rooms, a silent rehearsal of societal expectations. Historians still argue whether these rehearsals were common for all classes or primarily an elite preoccupation. Dance floors were also arenas for strategic alliances. You note a subtle exchange of bows between families across the room, a silent pact of respect or influence. Partners were selected with care, not merely for romantic potential, but for social positioning, reputation, and networking. You probably wouldn't think a simple dance could carry such weight, but every movement was a calculated decision, a combination of grace, politics, and etiquette. By the end of the evening, as music fades and couples drift off the floor, you feel the exhausting precision of this social ballet. Dance in Victorian society was a performance art, a coded conversation, and a subtle warfare of perception all at once. You trudge from the floor, slightly breathless, yet secretly exhilarated by having navigated this intricate, high-stakes dance of propriety, awareness, and performance. You slip into the softly lit parlor, the gentle clink of porcelain and the scent of Earl Grey enveloping you, and immediately recognize the delicate minefield of tea time taboos. Here, the act of sipping a cup of tea isn't merely a comforting ritual. It is a complex social test. You probably won't survive this socially unless you master the precise angle of your teacup, the rhythm of conversation, and the subtle cues hidden in gestures. The ritual begins with placement. Cups, saucers, teaspoons, and plates each have designated spots on the table, and misalignment could suggest ignorance or carelessness. You trudge along, adjusting a teacup as a cautious observer, realizing even the type of tea, poured black, green, or herbal, could carry unspoken messages about refinement or health. Historians still argue whether these exacting placements were rigorously followed or mostly aspirational, intended to impress visitors rather than enforce strict rules. Stirring to carries weight. You rotate the spoon lightly, clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on tradition, and avoid clinking it against the porcelain. A faux pas, it could evoke quiet judgment. Fringe etiquette guides describe specific wrist angles to ensure proper circulation of sugar and milk, a practice that some historians question regarding its real-world prevalence. A shaky hand might unintentionally signal nervousness or impropriety, adding pressure to an already meticulous ritual. Conversation during tea is an equally precise art. Safe topics include literature, gardening, or recent polite society events. Politics, religion, and personal gossip are verboten. You note a gentle nod or tilt of a teacup as a silent cue signaling agreement, a form of nonverbal dialogue still debated by scholars in terms of frequency. Fringe practices even mention tea codes, tiny gestures with the spoon or napkin used to convey messages discreetly to attentive friends, an almost espionage-like layer of social interaction. Seating arrangements reinforce hierarchy. Guests are positioned based on age, gender, and social rank, and misplacement could offend powerful hosts. You trudge past the table, observing a subtle shuffle as a new arrival settles into a carefully prescribed chair, and understand that even minor adjustments are acts of negotiation. Fringe anecdotes describe chairs slightly angled to facilitate private whispering between allies, a practice historians still debate in terms of authenticity versus myth. Pouring etiquette is no less demanding. The host must pour tea for others first, never for themselves, and cups must be filled just below the rim. Too much liquid could signal recklessness. Too little might suggest stinginess or inattention. Milk and sugar have their own guidelines, and failing to respect the established sequence could subtly shame both server and guest. Some texts even describe coded sugar cubes, where the order of adding sugar indicated nuanced social signals. A fringe practice rarely corroborated, but entertaining to imagine. By the end of tea, you feel a mixture of relief and admiration. The act, simple in appearance, is a careful dance of alignment, pouring, sipping, and speaking. You probably won't survive this socially without attention to detail, patience, and a willingness to participate in a ritual that turns a beverage into a performance of etiquette, status, and quiet negotiation. You trudge back from the parlor, noting the faint aroma of tea leaves, realizing that even this small daily custom carries the weight of centuries of expectation, subtle power dynamics, and an artful, sometimes absurd, command of decorum. You step onto the cobblestone street, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages mingling with the distant whistle of a train, and immediately sense the subtle tension of public transport panic. Riding an omnibus or early train wasn't tea simply about getting from point A to B. It was a social gauntlet. You probably won't survive this socially unless you understand seating hierarchy, elbow etiquette, and the silent choreography of avoidance. Seating was a minefield. The front seats nearest the driver often signaled higher status, while the rear was considered less desirable. You trudge along the aisle, feeling the cramped proximity of fellow passengers, and realize that even brushing shoulders required skillful calculation. Historians still argue whether strict hierarchies applied to all classes or were more strictly enforced among the wealthy and socially ambitious. Fringe accounts describe silent competitions for preferred spots, with subtle glances and slight shifts of weight signaling claims or concessions. Touch etiquette was intense. Accidental shoulder brushes, leaning too close, or crossing legs incorrectly could provoke murmured criticism. You notice a young man adjusting his coat to avoid contact, understanding that even inadvertent contact could be read as aggression or impropriety. Some fringe manuals suggested carrying small fans or walking sticks strategically to create personal space, a delicate negotiation of physical boundaries that feels oddly theatrical today. Conversation followed unspoken rules as well. Speaking loudly or directing one's voice toward an unintended listener was considered uncouth. You trudge past a cluster of women exchanging quiet remarks about the weather, observing how they tilt heads and shift fans subtly to maintain privacy while still being polite. Historians still debate the extent to which these silent communication methods were used versus exaggerated in etiquette literature. Grooming and posture mattered even in transit. Men polished shoes and straightened jackets. Women adjusted gloves and skirts. Fringe etiquette suggests some passengers even carried small mirrors to ensure that their appearance remained impeccable throughout the journey, a practice historians still argue about in terms of prevalence. You trudge past a lady carefully lifting her veil to check her reflection in a window pane, aware that failing these subtle standards could result in whispered judgments that followed one home. Timing and boarding were also fraught with unspoken rules. You must wait for the proper signal, avoid cutting in line, and carefully navigate luggage placement to avoid offense. Fringe anecdotes describe passengers exchanging coded gestures, slight nods, eye shifts to indicate whether one could board first or defer to another, a miniature diplomacy unfolding silently within the confines of a carriage. By the end of your journey, you feel both relief and admiration. Public transport in Victorian times was not just mobility. It was a delicate choreography, a test of patience, awareness, and social intelligence. You probably won't survive this socially without acute attention to hierarchy, touch, posture, and timing. You trudge off the omnibus, noticing the distant rattle of wheels on tracks, understanding that even something as mundane as a ride could be transformed into an elaborate performance of etiquette, perception, and quiet power. You wander into the dimly lit library, the scent of old leather and ink hanging thick in the air, and immediately feel the weight of reading room rules. Books weren't just sources of knowledge. They were instruments of status, decorum, and sometimes subtle rebellion. You probably won't survive this socially unless you navigate the careful dance of borrowing, handling, and discussing volumes with the right degree of respect. Handling books was ritualized. You trudge along polished shelves, fingers grazing spines, noting that even the angle at which you pull a book mattered. Pull too forcefully, and you risked seeming brash. Too gently, and you might appear timid or uncertain. Some libraries had leather straps or cords to protect rare editions, and fringe etiquette dictated that you observe these protections as a mark of respect. Historians still argue whether such careful handling was universally expected or mainly limited to elite institutions. Seating within the reading room was not arbitrary. Chairs near windows were coveted for light. Seats close to supervisors signaled propriety. Peripheral locations allowed quiet observation of social dynamics. You notice a young scholar shifting in his seat to avoid blocking another's line of sight. A subtle nod to etiquette that feels like choreography. Fringe manuals mention reserved postures. Wear folding one, as hands in a certain way or placing a book at a precise angle communicated silent messages about literacy and refinement. Though historians debate how common this practice really was, discussion of books required tact. You trudge through a conversation about poetry, careful to praise appropriately while avoiding overstatement. Excessive critique might imply arrogance, while lukewarm approval could suggest ignorance. Some fringe guides describe coded compliments or gestures hidden in the page corners of shared notes. Secret language between literate friends still debated for its actual prevalence. Borrowing books followed unspoken protocols. You note the precise method for requesting a volume, gently handling it with a handkerchief if necessary. Rare editions demanded formal approval. Some houses even required written requests with carefully crafted language to indicate respect. Fringe tailies include miniature keys or markers left in pages to signify in use or pending return, creating a silent dialogue between library goers and caretakers. Historians still argue whether these practices were routine or exaggerated in anecdotal accounts. Books themselves were curated to signal taste. Leather bindings, gilded lettering, and even placement on shelves indicated wealth, education, and refinement. You trudge past a section of French literature, noting the meticulous alignment and dusting, a performance of order as much as appreciation. Fringe stories suggest secret marginalia, witty or rebellious notes left for trusted friends, blending subversion with decorum. By the end of your visit, you feel the subtle intensity of Victorian literary etiquette. Reading wasn't merely personal enrichment. It was a performative act, a measure of status, a careful navigation of social norms. You probably won't survive this socially without patience, discretion, and attention to detail. You trudge back from the library, inhaling the quiet scent of leather and ink, realizing that every interaction with books, every glance, fold, or conversation was imbued with meaning, expectation, and a delicate dance of observation that only the most attentive could navigate gracefully. You wander into the softly lit music room, the faint hum of a piano string still resonating, and immediately sense the gravity of musical manners. Here, playing or listening to music isn't merely entertainment. It's a complex social language. You probably won't survive this socially unless you master posture, hand placement, audience awareness, and the subtle conveyance of taste. Performances follow strict rules. You trudge up to the piano, noting the careful alignment of sheet music, the spacing of keys, and the gentle angle of fingers on ivory. Even the type of music performed carries meaning. Sonatas and nocturnes were considered refined, while folk tunes or popular songs might signal casual or lower-class associations. Historians still argue whether these distinctions were enforced strictly or were aspirational for aspiring elites. Fringe practices include subtle tempo variations to signal mood or sentiment to an attentive audience, a kind of musical whispering that few today would recognize. Seating for listeners was equally orchestrated. Those of higher social rank were seated prominently, nearest to the performer, while guests of lesser status observed from the periphery. You notice subtle nods of approval or slight tilts of the head from onlookers, signaling appreciation or critique. Fringe accounts even suggest that some performers inserted hidden motifs to indicate family alliances or political affiliations, a practice historians still debate regarding its frequency. Participation was guided by unspoken etiquette. You trudge past others waiting for their turn, understanding that interrupting, playing out of sequence, or improvising excessively could be interpreted as disrespectful. Women were often expected to perform with poise, men with controlled confidence, and any deviation risked gossip or social censure. Some manuals provided intricate hand signals or subtle glances to coordinate duets or ensemble pieces, a nearly invisible layer of social code. Instruments themselves were symbols of refinement. Pianos, violins, and harpsichords were carefully maintained, polished, and displayed to convey both wealth and education. Fringe practices included customizing sheet music with marginal notes or delicate annotations meant only for a trusted few, blending subtle communication with art. Historians still argue how common these secretive, coded markings were versus anecdotal exaggeration. Listening carried its own rules. Applause was measured and restrained. Even sighs or gasps were moderated. You trudge along, noting the gentle tapping of a foot or a hand held lightly over the heart as silent markers of engagement or approval. Discussion afterward required tact, praise for the performance, and avoidance of overt critique that might embarrass the performer. Fringe anecdotes describe hidden winks or nods as quiet messages of encouragement or flirtation, a nuanced social dance layered within musical appreciation. By the end of the recital, you feel the immersive weight of musical etiquette. Performing or listening in Victorian society was not mere pastime. It was a demonstration of taste, restraint, and subtle communication. You probably won't survive this socially without attention to posture, expression, and unspoken codes. You trudge away from the piano, fingers tingling from invisible pressure, realizing that every note, pause, and glance is loaded with meaning, weaving a delicate tapestry of refinement, observation, and social navigation that extends far beyond the music itself. You step into the softly lit dining room, the polished silverware gleaming faintly in the candlelight, and immediately feel the oppressive weight of table talk taboos. Every gesture, utensil, and morsel carries meaning. You probably won't survive this socially unless you master the choreography of eating, speaking, and observing simultaneously. Placement of utensils is paramount. You trudge past a meticulously set table, noting the precise alignment of knives, forks, and spoons. Outer utensils are used first, inner utensils later, a sequence designed to display knowledge and refinement. Historians still argue whether these rules were universally followed or mainly aspirational for the socially ambitious. Fringe practices include tiny hand signals or subtle adjustments of cutlery to communicate private messages at the table, a covert language still debated for its prevalence. Napkin use is equally delicate. You carefully unfold it on your lap without creasing or dropping it, aware that improper handling could provoke silent judgment. Fringe etiquette suggests folding corners or edges in specific ways to signal politeness, readiness, or even subtle dissent, a practice historians are still uncertain about. You notice a faint crease in the napkin of a nearby guest and wonder what message it carries, realizing that even fabric becomes a medium of communication. Conversation at the table follows invisible scripts. Safe topics include travel, literature, and weather, while politics or money are often avoided. You trudge along with small comments, careful not to dominate the discussion or laugh too loudly. Fringe sources describe coded phrases or inside jokes hidden within polite exchanges, allowing discreet flirtation or commentary as subtlety. Historians still debate in terms of widespread practice. The pace of eating carries meaning as well. You chew slowly, never reaching for more food before everyone is served, and you carefully navigate shared dishes without overindulging. Overeating signals greed. Undereating suggests fragility or lack of appetite for social life. Fringe practices mention tiny hand gestures or the deliberate adjustment of a plate to indicate preference, refusal, or approval. A silent dialogue embedded within the meal. Serving and receiving food is ritualized. Hosts pour tea or offer dishes in precise order, while guests respond with grace and restraint. You notice a delicate bow accompanying the receipt of a plate, a gesture loaded with social signaling. Fringe accounts describe secretive small bites or hidden tasting of dishes as a form of covert enjoyment, a playful rebellion against strict observation, though historians still debate how common these acts were. By the end of the meal, you feel the intricate web of observation and performance that Victorian dining demanded. Each bite, gesture, and comment is part of an elaborate ballet of etiquette and perception. You probably won't survive this socially without acute awareness, patience, and precision. You trudge back from the table, noting the glint of polished silver and the soft rustle of napkins, realizing that eating was never just nourishment. It was a performance, a communication, and a carefully coded map of social hierarchy, expectation, and subtle interaction. You drift into the parlor once again, the smell of polished wood and faintly burning candle wicks wrapping around you, and immediately sense the invisible tension of visiting rules and guest etiquette. In Victorian society, calling on someone or being called was far from casual. It was a nuanced dance of timing, introduction, and behavior. You probably won't survive this socially unless you master the choreography of arrival, conversation, and departure without committing any faux pas. Arrival demanded precision. You trudge up the front steps and pause at the door, noting the height of the step, the angle of the knock, and the timing between each wrap. Too early or too late could suggest impertinence. Knocking too loudly or softly could betray inexperience. Fringe practices included leaving tiny tokens at the doorstep to signal intent or status, though historians still argue how commonly such rituals were employed beyond elite households. Introductions were ritualized as well. You extend your hand just so, slightly bow, and maintain the precise eye contact required. Conversation starters were predetermined, safe topics rehearsed in advance, and addressing the wrong person first could quietly scandalize. Historians still debate whether these rules were universally internalized or mainly aspirational guidelines for the ambitious. Fringe anecdotes describe whispered cues from host servants, subtly directing greetings and exchanges without overt interference. During the visit, posture and attention were constantly monitored. You sit, stand, or adjust your hat with care, each movement scrutinized for respectfulness and composure. Fringe etiquette suggests some guests carried small hand mirrors or pocket fans to adjust subtly without being noticed, an almost theatrical preparation for scrutiny that historians still debate in terms of actual practice. Conversations were governed by layered protocols. You speak softly, laugh lightly, and signal engagement without dominating. Sharing personal opinions required nuanced language. Overfamiliarity suggested audacity, while too much restraint implied disinterest. Fringe examples include tiny glances or slight nods at certain intervals, signaling comprehension or approval, a silent rhythm woven into dialogue that historians still discuss as either a pervasive social code or an anecdotal embellishment. Departure was equally choreographed. Leaving too early could insult the host. Lingering too long might suggest desperation or laziness. You trudge to the door, timing the step carefully, ensuring the farewell conveys gratitude, politeness, and awareness of social hierarchy. Some fringe accounts describe sending small notes or tokens afterward to solidify relationships, a practice historians still debate regarding frequency. By the end of your visit, you feel the intricate lattice of observation, timing, and subtle signals that Victorian society demanded of guests. Every step, word, and gesture was part of a carefully scripted performance. You probably won't survive this socially without acute awareness, grace, and patience. You step back onto the quiet street, noting the soft clatter of carriage wheels in the distance, realizing that visiting was never casual. It was a delicate exercise in communication, hierarchy, and careful navigation of human perception. You find yourself in the drawing room once again, a faint aroma of lavender and polished wood enveloping you, and immediately sense the world of conversation and correspondence codes. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, and every letter sent carried layers of meaning. You probably won't survive this socially unless you master the delicate rhythm of speech, the art of polite listening, and the subtle codes embedded in daily communication. Conversation followed strict patterns. You trudge along, noticing the precise timing of responses, the careful modulation of voice, and the way compliments were delivered with just the right measure of humility. Too much enthusiasm could be interpreted as frivolity. Too little could suggest indifference or rudeness. Fringe practices included hidden gestures, like lightly tapping a finger on the table, or adjusting a fan to signal agreement, interest, or warning, an almost invisible dialogue that historians still debate in terms of prevalence. Listening was an art in itself. You lean in slightly, nod just enough, and refrain from overt interruption. Eyes conveyed engagement without dominance, a delicate balance of attention and restraint. Some fringe etiquette guides describe using subtle tilts of the head or shifts in posture to indicate silent approval, or even disagreement, a sophisticated language of nuance that historians still argue about regarding its actual widespread use. Letters reinforced spoken communication. You notice the careful sealing of envelopes, the precise folding of sheets, and the subtle choice of ink or paper. Messages were coded, sometimes with small symbols or annotations understood only by the intended recipient. Fringe examples include playful marginalia or slight variations in handwriting. To convey intimacy or caution practices historians debate as either common or anecdotal curiosities. Even trivial comments could carry weight. You trudge past a group discussing the weather, noting the exaggerated attentiveness required to maintain propriety. Politeness was not just expected, it was a social performance. Fringe anecdotes describe small, almost imperceptible signals, sighs, slight coughs, or hand movements that could subtly influence the direction of conversation or the perception of a guest, leaving historians questioning how widely these nuances were observed. Hierarchy permeated every interaction. Speaking to someone of higher social standing required carefully modulated deference, while interactions with peers allowed slightly more freedom. You observe a subtle bow accompanying a compliment, a quiet affirmation of respect. Fringe sources mention micro-gestures embedded in these interactions, like the angle of a teacup or the fold of a napkin, signaling understanding or allegiance. Practices still debated in historical scholarship. By the end of the afternoon, you feel the meticulous choreography of Victorian communication pressing gently but firmly around you. Every glance, gesture, and utterance was a deliberate act of social navigation. You probably won't survive this socially without patience, observation, and an almost meditative awareness of nuance. You trudge back from the drawing room, feeling the faint brush of fabric and the subtle echo of voices, realizing that conversation, like letters and gestures, was a living language, a carefully coded ballet that defined social standing, respect, and the delicate art of human connection in the Victorian era.